this gradually dawned on me as I saw all sorts of things that were specific to that time period and to the nature of the horror that the Nazis perpetrated by means of the so-called final solution. Jack's typewriter, a German machine, Adler, which means eagle, and Kubrick very often in his films would use the eagle as a representation of dangerous state power, and it's an obvious one for Germany. Why would Jack have an Adler typewriter? Again, because Kubrick was a realistic filmmaker, not a naturalistic one. He wanted things to be real because he's talking about the real world, but they're not going to be naturalistic because he wants to use everything in his scenes to make larger points. And so the question would be, well, why an Adler typewriter? And the prosaic answer is, well, Kubrick had an Adler typewriter, and apparently that's the one they used in the scene. However, because it's Kubrick, at the very least, Kubrick would have to be aware that putting a German typewriter in his film and having it be the center of Jack's descent into madness would raise questions in the audience. And so it seems likely that he was at least aware of the associations people might make, or I think even more likely, he was setting up a pattern of reference on a very subliminal level that said, you know, I'm talking about, in the context of a horror film, I'm using that artificial horror as a means to get at the real horror that concerns me. And certainly Kubrick's always been concerned with the bad things that have happened in the world. And so it would be hardly surprising that he wouldn't make reference to the Holocaust. And so there's that typewriter. And then the thing that I think really clinches it for me, if it weren't there, I would be much less sure about my thesis, and that is the constant repetition of the number 42. And 42 is a number that in many ways in the history of the Holocaust is associated with the final solution, because it was in January of 1942 that the Nazis all gathered, and Reinhard Heydrich told all these other top Nazis, in effect, that Hitler had said, we're going to do this, we're going to kill them all, and here's how we're going to do it. And so the fact that 42 keeps popping up throughout that film can't be an accident. There can't be that many accidents. It's clearly part of a pattern of reference. And then if you go back into Kubrick's own cinema, and you go back all the way to Lolita, you find out that Vladimir Nabokov, in his novel, used the number 42 as something that would pop up in the life of Humbert Humbert. Everywhere he went was the number 42. It would be an address. It would be a hotel room number. It would be a highway sign number. And Nabokov used 42 as a symbol of the sort of malevolent fate that was stalking Humbert, and also of his own paranoia. And although Kubrick doesn't make anything of it in his own film of Lolita, he only mentions 42 once visually, I think that stayed with him. And I think, he was a great lover in coincidences. He just was fascinated with coincidences. And he essentially saw them, on the one hand, he saw them as Jungian. That is, Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, said that, coincidences are signs of these large forces, spiritual forces moving in the world. And so Kubrick was interested on those grounds. But Freud also had a thing about coincidences, and he said, of course, that they were the sign of unconscious motives and of neurotic patterns of behavior. And Kubrick was very well read in Freud. And so I'm sure all of these things together culminated in his decision at some level of consciousness to use that number 42 as a sign and a symbol of the Nazi extermination of the Jews. And there are lots of other things in the film. The music, a lot of the music has connections with the 1930s and 40s and with fascism and with Nazism. And so all of those things taken together, I think, show that while Kubrick, for artistic and personal reasons, didn't want to make a film about the Holocaust, or finally couldn't make one, he had to, at several levels of consciousness, give expression to that particular interest. And I think it came out most clearly in The Shining,